I'm going to share with you verse 17 from chapter 8 of the Gita. I'll first read the Sanskrit verse and then I will read the English translation of it. Sahasra yuga paryantam aharyad brahmano viduhu ratrim yuga sahasrantam te ho ratra vido janaha. And now, the English translation is written by Swami Kriyananda. They truly know the day and night who comprehend the day of Brahma, which endures for 1,000 mahayugas, and the night of Brahma, which endures for another 1,000 mahayugas. I'm actually going to read the next couple of verses also because I think they're all relevant to our discussion today. At the dawn of Brahma's day, creation remanifested emerges from its night state of unmanifestation. At the dusk of Brahma's night, all creation sinks back into its previous unmanifested state. Again and again, O Arjuna, the same people throng back to earth to be reborn. The cycle of reincarnation ends for them only temporarily with the descent of Brahma's night. It resumes again with the dawn of Brahma's day. Now, when you read these verses from the Gita, it almost sounds like a science fiction movie or something like that. Like you're watching a Matrix or something that you don't quite understand. It's fascinating to think about, but you don't quite know what it means. So anyway, we'll try to explore some of that this morning. The song that I shared for you, I've always found this image of Divine Mother quite fascinating and very deep to meditate on, of Kali. There are many meanings to the word Kali. Sometimes people translate it as the dark form of Divine Mother. One of the meanings that is, again, just coming from the word itself, comes from the root Kala, or time. And Kali represents that eternal delusion of time, or rather one who stands beyond and behind that delusion of time. A few weeks ago we saw this verse from the Gita about the Om vibration, how the spirit manifested its creation from God that was completely still, and outside of any vibration came this primordial cosmic vibration of Om, and from that everything else manifested. You see, when there's vibration, there's movement. And with that very first vibration of creation, the first element or aspect of Maya that comes into existence is the delusion of time. Because this, I call it the delusion of time, you know. I think it was during my days of college that I read Stephen Hawking's, I'm blanking out on the name of the book, his bestseller book that's very small. Anyway. But he talked about the space-time continuum. That was, essential part of his research. I'm sure most of you know Stephen Hawking, the scientist who was on a wheelchair and who used to speak through this device that was attached to his vocal cord. There was even a movie made about A Brief History of Time. Thank God the name came to me. And I was always fascinated with this idea of how time itself is a construct of the rational mind, that causality is not implicit in the universe. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Before even going further, I want to share a joke with you because it is quite on the lines of the verse that we just read. Of course, it's a joke, it's not a real story or anything. This is the story of a man in India who read the Gita and who heard from all the wise sages that 1 second in the world of Brahma, in the world of the gods, is 100 million seconds in this material plane, and $1 or 1 rupee in Brahma's world is $100 million or rupees on this plane. And he immediately becomes very pious and he starts performing a lot of austerities and rituals, and he's very dedicated and focused in his efforts. And finally, God shows up for him, and Brahma shows up in front of him and asks him, what do you need, my dear? You've been performing all these austerities and being so devoted to me. And this man says, nothing, Lord, I don't need nothing much from you. I just need a rupee. I just need 1 rupee and I'll be fine forever. And Brahma smiles at him and says, sure, give me a second, I'll be back. Anyway, it's a joke because you don't quite know what to make of all this. You don't quite know what to do with the day of Brahma that goes for 10,000 mahayugas that Krishna is talking about. I want to start by sharing this story. There's a very interesting story, and I think this story almost summarizes the teaching of this verse. And this is a story from the Puranas, from the Indian scripture. It is from a specific scripture called the Brahma Vaivarta Purana. Although it is from the Indian scriptures, I have to mention that the first time I heard this story was in this documentary series called The Power of Myth. I don't know how many of you grew up with this. This is, before my times. I think it is from the 80s or 90s. I'm not quite sure. But I saw this documentary series. This entire series, I think there were 6 episodes, and they were all interviews with this great philosopher, scholar. He was a theologian, but also I think I don't quite know who he was. He was just a very wise sage. His name was Joseph Campbell. And The Power of Myth is a series of interviews with Joseph Campbell where he talks about cultures and mythology and religion and how they influence how we see life and how we live in this world, the socio-cultural implications of all of this. And he shares the story in that interview series, and that is where I first heard the story, but a few years ago went back and saw that again, and I also read the story from the Purana itself, and that's what I want to start by sharing this morning. And I have to say, maybe after this series, after this episode is over, I'll copy a link for that in the description. So if you want to watch, you can watch Joseph Campbell himself narrate the story. It is on YouTube, you can easily find it. So the story starts. This is the story of Indra, the lord of all gods. And the story starts with this demon by name Vritra, who is tormenting all the souls on planet Earth. And what Vritra does is he blocks all the water bodies in this world. He makes sure they are not available for any of the creatures in this world. And so there is this huge drought, and people are dying and suffering, and all creatures are suffering because of this demon. And Indra, being the lord of all gods, people pray to him, and he's pleased with their prayers, and he decides to rescue them. And Indra is also the lord of lightning bolt. That's his weapon of choice. And what Indra does is he brings his lightning bolt and he immediately attacks Vritra and he kills this demon. And as soon as the demon is dead, there is rains again. He strikes the clouds with his lightning bolt, and immediately rain pours down and there's water everywhere, and life is brought back and all creatures are happy again. But after this episode, Indra becomes a little proud of himself. He starts to think, wow, I must be really great, for I have saved so many people's lives. I have been able to restore the balance on this planet Earth. I'm certainly not, I'm somebody very accomplished. So he becomes a little full of himself. And he calls upon the architect of the gods. His name is Vishwakarma. So Indra calls Vishwakarma and tells him, I've realized that I'm the greatest being in this entire universe. I'm, after all, the lord of all the gods, and I've now saved planet Earth. I think it is only right for me that I have the best and the biggest palace in all of this universe. So I commission you to construct it for me. And Vishwakarma, of course, he's himself a god, and he starts building this palace. He doesn't make much of Indra's instruction. He does his best and he builds this palace, but Indra is never happy with what Vishwakarma does. He says, yes, this is beautiful, but I would like rubies on this archway entering into that doorway. I would like this silk draping on these windows. I don't think this is grand enough for Indra, who has to live here, reside in this palace. So he keeps constantly placing more and more demands on Vishwakarma, and Vishwakarma at one point realizes that this man is never going to be happy. This palace is never going to be complete, and this is going to go on forever. So he decides to approach Lord Brahma, the creator, and complain to Lord Brahma that Indra is so full of himself, and now he's stuck in this project that is never going to end. And Brahma says, oh, that's okay, you go home, I'll take care of this. And Brahma approaches Lord Vishnu, and he informs him of the situation, and Vishnu comforts Brahma by saying, don't worry, I'll take care of Indra, he's not that hard to deal with. And the next day, Vishnu shows up at the palace of Indra, and Vishnu comes as this young boy who is blue in complexion, wrapped in yellow silk, just as Krishna. So you can think of it as Krishna showing up in front of Indra's palace, and he's so charming. All the children and everybody around the palace are drawn to him, and he is playing his flute, and everybody is entranced by Krishna. And Indra, of course, is also charmed by him, and he invites him inside the palace. And Krishna says, "Wow, what a beautiful palace. I'm so impressed by what you've been able to accomplish, and this beautiful palace is certainly a testimony for your greatness." And then Krishna goes on to say, no Indra before you has ever built a palace of this grandeur, of this kind of beauty. And Indra is quite confused. He looks at Krishna and says, "What do you mean by Indra's before me? I'm immortal. I'm the god of all gods. What do you mean when you say Indra is before me and they have built palaces and all of that?" And Krishna chuckles and says, "Oh, Indra, you're just playing your part in this universe. You're playing a role. You're right now the god of all the gods. But I have seen not one, but not two. I've seen thousands of Indras come and go. Indras fall and Indras rise. One Indra falls and another Indra rises." And somebody else takes on that role. And I've seen this over and over again. And Indra is shocked. He had no idea. And he asks Krishna, "Wow, so how long does this go on? When does this all end?" And Krishna says, "No, it never does." And he says, every time Vishnu, the great Lord Vishnu on the cosmic ocean of consciousness, every time he opens his eyes, immediately there is a lotus springing from his navel. And from that lotus comes Brahma, the creator. And every time Brahma opens his eyes, a universe is brought into manifestation. That is the day of Brahma that Krishna is describing to Arjuna in this verse, which is 10,000 mahayugas. And he says, in each of this mahayuga, for every yuga there is an Indra that comes, and then he again falls down and he leaves, and then there is another Indra. So every time Brahma opens and closes his eyes, there is a complete day that is manifested. There is a yuga, there's a whole cycle of creation that is manifested. There is a universe that is manifested. And this universe consists of so many yugas. And when Brahma closes his eyes, all of this goes back into unmanifestation, as Krishna describes here. And again, Brahma opens his eyes. And Krishna goes on to say, but it doesn't stop there. Brahma keeps opening and closing his eyes as Vishnu is a witness watching all of this. And as Vishnu is seated, laying on his serpent bed on this cosmic sea of consciousness, there are so many Brahmas that come and go. They open and close their eyes a million times, and then they also go into unmanifestation. And then there is a new lotus springing out of Vishnu's navel. And then there is a new Brahma, and then he manifests thousands and thousands. He lives for thousands and thousands of days of Brahma, and for each day of Brahma, there is an Indra. And Indra, after hearing all of this, he's rather disillusioned, and he starts to get the point. And the story goes on to say, they're walking through the palace, and Indra and Krishna watch this very long row of ants that are in Indra's palace. And they both look and see this line of ants that are so neatly arranged, they cannot see the beginning or end of it. It just starts from somewhere and they're going somewhere. They don't even know where it begins and where it ends. And Krishna chuckles. And Indra asks, "Why are you chuckling?" And Krishna says, "Don't ask me unless you're prepared to be disappointed." And Indra says, "No, I want to learn. Please tell me." And Krishna says, "All these ants that you see here, all are Indras. All have been Indras. They were all here trying to build the best palace. And then they all fell down because of their own pride and arrogance. And they fell down and they kept falling down over and over and over again until they reached nothingness. They reached this ant, the stage of this ant, and now all these ants are fallen down Indras who are walking in your own palace." Now Indra at this point is completely disillusioned, and he decides to renounce all of his richness, his wealth, and his position and power, and become a yogi, start a life of penance and austerity. And at this point, his wife Indrani, who is very wise and who is also a beautiful consort to him, she approaches Brihaspati, or the Lord Guru, the way it is described, who is the teacher of all the gods, and she requests him to teach and counsel Indra, who comes back to Indra. And in this Purana and the scripture, Guru or Brihaspati is counseling Indra on how you do not need to renounce this world, just as Krishna is counseling Arjuna. Indra can play the part that is assigned to him in this universe and do his best. He does not need to denounce this creation in order to realize God. You don't have to turn your back from God's creation in order to learn the secrets of this universe. Now, that story is, of course, fascinating to even contemplate on. Yesterday I was meditating on this, and the first image that came to my mind, which I think about quite often, I grew up in South India, in the city of Chennai, and for those of you who know, it's a very, very warm place. As most of my friends in Chennai often describe it, there are 3 seasons in South India, which are summer, hot summer, and very hot summer. So that's how I grew up. And during those days of very hot summer, in the months of May and June, I remember we did not have air conditioning in our house when I was growing up. So we would go on the terrace, and that's where we would sleep at night, because indoors would be too hot for us to sleep. And I remember sleeping on this bamboo mat on the roof of my house in Chennai and looking at the stars. And it's perhaps, I'm giving all this context, but perhaps this experience or this feeling is common to all cultures, and all of you have experienced it, whether you've gone camping or in other settings. But as I would look at the stars, as I was a child, I was probably 7 or 8 years old, I would just wonder and think about, because I think by that point I'd already learned about galaxies and universes and stars and how vast everything is and how tiny planet Earth is in comparison to all of this. And I would just look at the stars and I would just think about how entirely insignificant my life is. How every thought, every action, anything I do is just such sheer triviality compared to what I was looking at. It's not even trivial compared to some cosmic scheme of things. It's just trivial to even that thing that I'm looking up above in the skies, all the stars and all the galaxies I'm looking at, and I'm this one tiny little speck of dust moving through space with this sense of self-importance, somehow thinking that what I care about, what I don't care about, what I want, what I don't want, are all somehow hugely important. Whereas even that moment of contemplation to realize how small we are in the grand scheme of things. That is not to trivialize our own role or our consciousness. That's where we want to understand this teaching. Because when we hear Krishna describe this cosmic view of time, Swami, I think, uses the phrase in his commentary on this verse. He says, the verse is spine-stiffening. I was thinking about that, how it really brings you back. It was spine-stiffening for Indra when he heard this teaching again from Krishna in this verse. Krishna is presenting it to Arjuna. It is spine-stiffening because it disillusions you. It brings you back to the essence of existence itself. It's that existential question of who am I? What am I doing here? What does this life mean in this grand scheme of existence? You see, we do not comprehend or realize that the significance by thinking about the vastness of time in terms of past and future. And that's where this teaching is almost ironical, because we realize the import of this teaching. We realize the significance of Brahma's day not by expanding our view of time to include times of past or times of future, because we just cannot, our human brains and minds just cannot expand to that extent. All that we can think about is 30 years before or 30 years afterwards. But we do start to approach the center of this awareness, of this consciousness, by actually living in the present moment, by not letting our consciousness drift into that past and future. There is this story, not a story actually, there is this conversation that I think Asha writes about in one of her books with Swami Kriyananda, where one devotee asked Swamiji, Master writes in one of his books, not writes, I think he shared with one of his disciples how he remembers as far back in his own incarnational cycle as being a diamond. So Master talks about how even before he was a living organism, well, the word living organism is not necessarily a description of anything. Living is a very debated word, so I won't use that. But even before he was, a mammal or a bird or a tree or a human person, he remembers being inanimate. He remembers being a diamond. And this devotee was asking Swamiji, if Master remembers being a diamond, I'm sure all of us were also rocks or gemstones or whatever we were. But, diamonds don't die. When does it stop? When do you stop being a diamond and become something else? I don't know what. What do you become after a diamond, or what were you before a diamond? And the question was more about, when does that cycle end? When do you stop? When do you come out of that inanimate phase? Because with a human person or an animal, there's birth and death. But with a diamond, how does that work? And, Swamiji, as always, he just breaks those questions apart and completely shifts your understanding outside of this kind of confusion of the mind. Swamiji responded to that question not directly, but with another idea, which in a way completely addresses what this person was asking. He said, compared to eternity, all time is nothing. All time is trivial compared to eternity. And that, in essence, is the teaching that Krishna is presenting to Arjuna here. Compared to eternity, all is nothing. And that song that I presented of Kamalakanta when we opened this episode, this description of Kali as one who entrances time, the song goes on. The other verse that I sang today morning, the literal translation of that verse is, this poet describes Kali as being the source of everything, the one who's beyond creation and the one who's eternal. And he says, before you manifested this creation of yours, he's joking with Kali as his own mother. Kali wears a garland of skulls, if you've seen pictures, and that's how she's often depicted. This poet asks Kali, before you manifested this universe of yours, where did you get skulls to make garlands out of? There's no answer to that question. It's not. Kali is just a symbol and an image, and that's how we relate to her, and it communicates that vibration to us when we relate to divine in that form. It's not like she really needed to make, human skulls before manifesting the universe. But that's truly what divine is, because this manifestation, this whole expression, outward expression of consciousness, comes out and goes back in. Brahma opens his eyes and he shuts his eyes. His day begins and his day ends. And in each day of Brahma, there's 10,000 mahayugas. Swamiji also talks about yugas and units of time and all of that. I mean, of course, I did not want to venture into that topic because we won't have enough time to discuss. I have a detailed description in a video on my YouTube channel if you want to learn more about how these units of time were explained by Yogananda ji. But in fact, in his commentary, Swami says he explicitly asked Yogananda ji about the 10,000 mahayugas and the day of Brahma and all of this, and whether they have, some kind of significance that we needed to understand. And actually, Yogananda ji just said, all that it means is that it's a very large unit of time. We are not going to do anything by knowing, okay, I'm in the day of Brahma. Am I on 9,991st Mahayuga in this day? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. In fact, Yogananda ji goes on to explain the days and nights of Brahma come and go. These universes come into manifestation and they go out of manifestation. That is the trajectory of creation, but that is not the trajectory of the individual soul. Time is cyclical. Creation is cyclical. By cyclical, I mean it comes out and it manifests itself and it goes back in. There is a day, there is a noon, there is an evening, and there's a night, and then there's a day again. So it goes over and over again through that same cycle. But individual souls, they do not go in a cycle like that. What I mean by that is when we make spiritual progress, when we expand our consciousness, if we continue to expand, as we continue to grow, we don't necessarily have to experience lower states of consciousness as long as we are in that state of expansion, in that process of expanding ourselves. And Yogananda ji specifically makes a point to explain that when we are liberated, when we achieve that state that Krishna describes in the Gita again and again to Arjuna, then even at the night of Brahma, our consciousness is pulled back into the God, but when it's remanifested, we are not remanifested as unconscious beings. Our state of spiritual evolution is tied to that individuality that we identify with. As much as we have completely dissolved in the sea of infinite, that spiritual evolution, that spiritual liberation is ours through eternity, through all the days of Brahma, through all the Indras and all the yugas over and over again. And that is also important for us to understand, because as much as we are talking about these cosmic periods of time and cycles that this planet goes through, our own individual souls are constantly trying to expand and trying to seek that liberation. So we don't have to be afraid of being pulled back into the night of Brahma and losing everything we have gained and needing to start back from being an ant or a rock or whatever the first state is. So, as we enter this New Year's, I'm still thinking about it, because this past week has also been all about resolutions and talking to people about what this new beginning means. As we meditate deeper, as we deepen our inner life, and as we take this new year with this new burst of enthusiasm and energy, I think it's something that we can take, this idea of living in that eternal time, especially during our meditation practice, to be able to pull back and to always stay aware in the present moment. And of course, the other teaching is pretty obvious, which is there's no reason to have any self-importance, because all of this is so darn trivial compared to a day of Brahma. So anyway, thank you for sharing this morning with me. I'll see you again next week with another verse from the 8th chapter, I think. We will see you next week. God bless you all.